The greatest fraud in history wasn't selling worthless flowers. It was selling the idea that this time would be different. Amsterdam, 1640s. The canals still smelled of prosperity, the warehouses groaned with spices from the Indies, and the Dutch golden age gleamed like freshly minted guilders. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, printed shares that turned merchants into kings. Paper became power. Contracts became fortunes. The entire republic learned that you didn't need to hold treasure, you just needed everyone to believe you held it. But beneath this glittering facade, a wound festered. Just 3 years earlier, in 1637, tulip bulbs had sold for the price of Amsterdam townhouses. Then, in a single week, the market evaporated. Fortunes turned to dust. Families collapsed. Suicides followed. The trauma was fresh, raw, and everyone swore, never again. Yet human nature has a fatal flaw. We don't learn from pain, we learn to rationalize it. And in that gap between memory and greed, Jan van der Meer saw his opportunity. He understood that the crashed weren't afraid of tulips. They were afraid of chaos. Give them order, legitimacy, the illusion of control, and they'd dive right back into the abyss. He would give them paper tulips. Beautiful, certified, utterly worthless paper tulips. And they would beg to buy them. Jan van der Meer had been dismissed from the VOC for creative bookkeeping, a polite term for embezzlement the company chose not to prosecute. He walked away with his reputation bruised but his connections intact, and more importantly, with an education in the one skill that mattered, making numbers tell stories people wanted to believe. Sitting in a Kalverstraat tavern, watching merchants trade VOC shares across beer-stained tables, he realized something profound. These men weren't trading cargo manifests or pepper shipments. They were trading confidence. The VOC's ships might sink, spices might rot, but as long as the certificates looked official and the dividends kept flowing, the illusion held. The company had weaponized paper. Why not do the same with tulips? The genius wasn't in the flowers themselves, everyone knew tulips could bankrupt you. The genius was in the packaging. Van der Meer spent weeks designing the perfect document, heavy parchment, embossed seals, watermarks visible only when held to candlelight. Each certificate represented ownership of rare tulip varieties, Semper Augustus, Viceroy, Admiral Van Horn, supposedly stored in climate-controlled secret facilities outside Amsterdam. He called it the Tulip Trust. The branding was surgical. Trust evoked the VOC's reliability. Secret facilities promised scarcity. And most brilliantly, he positioned it not as speculation but as correction, a way to invest in tulips properly, learning from past mistakes, with professional management and transparent accounting. The first sales pitch was to widows. Women whose husbands had died in the 1637 crash, left with nothing but bitterness and a desperate need for redemption. He told them their husbands weren't fools, they were pioneers betrayed by chaos. This time, with proper infrastructure, tulips could be what they should have been, stable stores of value, like gold or VOC shares. They wept as they signed. He took their last guilders and handed them beautifully forged certificates. The paper was worth more than the promise, but they would never know that. Word spread. Within months, the Tulip Trust had hundreds of investors. Van der Meer rented a grand office on Herengracht, hired clerks to maintain elaborate ledgers, and published quarterly reports showing steady returns. The certificates traded hands in coffeehouses and exchanges. Prices climbed. Everyone was making money. No one had seen an actual tulip. But Jan van der Meer understood the cardinal rule of confidence schemes: never let them see behind the curtain. As long as the documents looked legitimate and the profits kept flowing on paper, reality was irrelevant. He was building a cathedral of air. And everyone wanted to worship inside it. Klaas de Graaf noticed the Tulip Trust the way a shark notices blood in water. As a director of the VOC, he knew the language of financial manipulation intimately. More personally, the 1637 crash had obliterated his family. His father hanged himself after losing their estate on a single Semper Augustus bulb that turned out to be diseased. His mother died in a poorhouse. Klaas built his career on one principle: never again. When reports reached his desk about a new tulip venture trading at increasing values, his instincts screamed fraud. But he was patient. Accusations without proof would make him look like a bitter fool. Instead, he began watching. Following the paper trail. Tracking who bought certificates, who sold them, where the money flowed. What he found was elegant in its simplicity. The trust never claimed to sell tulips, only certificates representing future delivery rights. Van der Meer ran the scheme like a bank. Most investors never redeemed, they just traded paper. And for the rare few who demanded actual flowers, he purchased common varieties at market rates, presenting them as similar substitutes due to seasonal availability. The scheme only worked because everyone was complicit. Investors didn't want truth, they wanted prices to rise. City officials didn't want investigations, they wanted tax revenue. Even skeptics stayed quiet, afraid of triggering another crash that would drag down legitimate markets. De Graaf realized he was watching a cancer metastasize. The Tulip Trust now held investments from half of Amsterdam's merchant class. If it collapsed suddenly, it would trigger bank runs, credit freezes, and potentially undermine confidence in the VOC itself, since many people held both trust certificates and company shares, viewing them as equivalent instruments. But de Graaf didn't want to prevent the collapse. He wanted to control it. He began his counterplay methodically. First, using VOC resources, he commissioned agents to quietly investigate the secret facilities Van der Meer claimed to operate. What they found was predictable: rented warehouses, empty except for a few dried bulbs and theatrical props designed to impress any accidental visitors. Second, he started buying. Not trust certificates, those were worthless. He bought real tulip bulbs. Every rare variety Van der Meer claimed to hold in reserve, de Graaf purchased from actual growers across Holland and Flanders. Semper Augustus. Viceroy. Admiral Liefkens. If Van der Meer's documentation claimed reserves of 50 bulbs, de Graaf quietly acquired 60 of the real thing. It cost him a fortune, but the VOC's capital was effectively infinite. And he wasn't making an investment. He was loading a cannon. Meanwhile, Van der Meer's operation was entering its crisis phase. As certificate prices climbed, he faced a classic pyramid trap. He needed constant new money to pay off earlier investors demanding returns. To maintain confidence, he published reports of record harvests and unprecedented bloom quality. Each lie required another. His ledgers became labyrinths of fraud. Desperate, he began borrowing from moneylenders at ruinous rates, using the borrowed funds to secretly buy his own certificates, inflating prices artificially. He was now both architect and victim of his own scheme, trapped in a cycle where stopping meant exposure and continuing meant deeper debt. His clerks noticed discrepancies. He paid them off. City inspectors asked questions. He bribed them with shares. A few investors demanded to visit the facilities. He staged elaborate theater, showing them empty barrels marked with exotic variety names, confident they couldn't distinguish a Semper Augustus from a common rosin. But every patch widened the crack. The weight of the lie was becoming unsustainable. And de Graaf was ready. The trap snapped shut on a cold February morning in 1644. Klaas de Graaf arrived at the Tulip Trust offices with city magistrates, VOC legal counsel, and a demand written in iron: produce the bulbs. Van der Meer had prepared for this moment with the desperation of the damned. He produced ledgers showing carefully documented reserves, warehouse receipts with official seals, and testimonials from hired experts, confirming the quality of his holdings. The documents were masterpieces. He'd spent weeks perfecting every detail. De Graaf smiled. And then he delivered the counterstrike. I'm not asking for documents. I'm asking for tulips. Physical bulbs. Today. Now. All of them. Van der Meer's face went white. The harvest season. Your quarterly report, published 3 weeks ago, claims optimal storage conditions year-round. Your advertisements promise immediate delivery upon request. So deliver. 200 Semper Augustus bulbs. 150 Viceroy. 80 Admiral Leafkins. I have the capital. I'm making the purchase. Refuse, and I'll have you arrested for fraud before sunset. The room went silent. Every clerk, every investor present understood what was happening. This wasn't an inspection. This was an execution. Van der Meer tried to negotiate. He offered settlement terms, proposed delayed delivery, suggested alternative compensation. Each word dug his grave deeper. The magistrates took notes. The crowd outside grew as word spread through the financial district. De Graaf gave him 3 days. Van der Meer spent those 72 hours in a frantic catastrophe of desperation. He sent agents across Holland trying to buy bulbs at any price. But the market had been stripped bare, someone had purchased every premium variety months ago. He considered fleeing to England or France, but his debts had grown tentacles. Moneylenders owned his house, his furniture, his clothes. Running meant death. On the 3rd day, he appeared before the magistrates with 17 common tulip bulbs and a confession written in shaking hands. The Tulip Trust had no reserves. The facilities were empty. Every certificate was worthless paper. He had defrauded approximately 800 investors of more than 200,000 guilders. The market reaction was biblical. Certificate holders tried to sell, finding no buyers. Those who'd borrowed against their holdings faced ruin. Banks that had accepted trust certificates as collateral suddenly held nothing. For 48 hours, Amsterdam's financial district teetered on the edge of total collapse. And then Klaas de Graaf made his move. The VOC announced an emergency buyback program. They would purchase Tulip Trust certificates at 10% of face value, a devastating loss, but enough to prevent total annihilation. In exchange, certificate holders would sign affidavits swearing to never again invest in speculative tulip ventures and acknowledging the VOC as the sole reliable investment vehicle in the Republic. The city magistrates, terrified of riots and bank runs, endorsed the plan immediately. It wasn't mercy. It was conquest. De Graaf had engineered the crisis, controlled the collapse, and now leveraged the disaster to cement the VOC's financial monopoly. Every merchant who took the buyback became a permanent stakeholder in the company's dominance. As for Van der Meer, his fate was sealed the moment the confession left his lips. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced within a week. The punishment was designed for maximum spectacle, public humiliation followed by execution. Not hanging, that was too quick. He would be bound to a wheel and broken, bone by bone, while crowds watched from the Newmarkt. The execution drew thousands. They threw rotten vegetables and cursed him as the embodiment of greed. No one mentioned the city officials who'd looked the other way, or the investors who'd known but didn't care, or the fundamental truth that everyone had been complicit. Van der Meer became the scapegoat, the single point of failure, the reason this never should have happened. He died screaming. The crowd cheered. And the VOC's stock price reached new heights that afternoon. 10 years later, Amsterdam's economy had fully recovered. The canals still flowed with commerce, the warehouses still groaned with spices, and the Dutch Golden Age continued its glittering march forward. The Tulip Trust was remembered as an unfortunate aberration, a cautionary tale told to warn against greed and gullibility. No one called it what it actually was, proof that the entire system was built on collective delusion. Because here's the part no one wanted to examine too closely, the VOC operated on exactly the same principles as Van der Meer's scheme. Shares in a company that owned ships you'd never see, trading spices you'd never touch, generating profits documented in ledgers you'd never audit. It was paper representing paper, all backed by nothing more substantial than the collective agreement that it was valuable. The difference wasn't legitimacy. The difference was scale and official sanction. Van der Meer's fraud failed because it was too small, too obvious, too vulnerable. The VOC succeeded because it had armies, colonial governors, and the full backing of the state. It could enforce its illusions with violence if necessary. Klaas de Graaf understood this perfectly. He'd used the Tulip Trust crisis not to expose financial fraud but to eliminate competition. He'd proven that in the new economy, whoever controlled the paper controlled the future. The VOC didn't just survive the collapse, it emerged stronger, having absorbed thousands of new investors who now had no choice but to believe in its stability. The certificates Van der Meer printed weren't fake because they represented nothing real. They were fake because the wrong person printed them. Had the VOC issued identical documents, backed by identical empty warehouses, they would have been honored across Europe. The magic wasn't in the substance. It was in the seal. Amsterdam learned its lesson. But not the lesson they thought. They didn't learn to distrust paper promises. They learned to only trust paper promises backed by sufficient violence and institutional authority. The age of speculation didn't end with Van der Meer's execution. It just became respectable. The city still trades in beautiful lies, printed on expensive paper, decorated with official seals. The warehouses are still mostly empty. The ledgers still creative. But now everyone agrees to pretend together, and that agreement, enforced by law and custom and the implicit threat of ruin for dissenters, makes it real. Van der Meer's mistake wasn't the fraud. His mistake was doing it alone. In the great cathedral of paper wealth, there's only one unforgivable sin: building your own altar without permission from the priests. He printed certificates. The VOC printed futures. Same ink. Same paper. One man died screaming. The other built an empire. It wasn't justice. It was just business.